So this is going to be kind of a different video. I'm going to react to a video called How I Became Fluent in Spanish Not in 30 Days because I thought the title was interesting and it was also kind of a viral video. If you don't know me, my name is Hamid. I'm 15 years old and I became a polyglot at 13 years old after getting fluent in Spanish. Here's how I sounded before then.
Hola, estoy comiendo comida. Voy a mejorar mi español.
Y bueno, para mostrarte que hablo español, voy a seguir hablando en español. Y sí, en este video voy a ver un video de un youtuber que se llama Jerry Register. Okay, so the reason why I found this interesting was because personally I got fluent in 120 hours of studying Spanish, and it was during the summer of 2022 mostly that I spent time studying, and I got conversationally fluent after that amount of time. And in 30 days, that would be like 4 hours a day for 30 days, which is entirely possible and like normal, feasible. So I found this topic kind of interesting, so yeah.
I tried everything to learn Spanish, and all of it was a waste of time except for 5 things. The 5 keys that took me from 0 to fluent in Spanish. And I'm going to share all 5 of them with you. I've wanted to learn Spanish for as long as I can remember, ever since moving to the US from Haiti and growing up in Black and Latino communities. And I wanted to talk to people and make friends, but I couldn't a lot of times because it felt like there was this invisible wall keeping me out. Well, today I can finally say that I am a fluent Spanish speaker, and it feels so good to say that. I've gone from knowing 0 Spanish to just a few months ago taking the Spanish C2 exam, which is probably the hardest Spanish certification exam in the entire world. And I've done interviews on the streets of Mexico and Argentina with natives in full Spanish. So it almost feels as if I have a home in almost every continent, and it's a really cool feeling and a dream come true. But it wasn't easy, and I wish I'd had someone when I first started learning Spanish to guide me and help me avoid wasting efforts and getting frustrated like I did. I tried a lot, failed, and learned a ton about what works and what doesn't work to become fluent. So I'll share it all with you to help you avoid making the same mistakes that I did. Our story starts out during my childhood. Near the house and at school, my childhood was filled with sounds already spoke by the other 2 foreign sounds I was hearing around me at the time. I had to learn them. And I learned English naturally pretty fast, since that's what I was surrounded by most and what I was being taught in ESL. Okay, so I had Creole, my native language, and English, my second language. 2 down, 0 Spanish. So my English kept getting better, but I never found a moment to start learning Spanish. So why am I telling you about this part? Because I did pick up one of the first and most valuable keys to learning Spanish. I built a deep interest, curiosity, and fascination in the Spanish language.
Okay, that is actually a really good point. When I first started getting fluent in Spanish, my sort of motivation was this guy in my class was using Duolingo, and he started seeing improvement. And the reason why that was kind of impressive and stuff was because he was like not very smart student, or he didn't have insanely good grades compared to like everyone else, but in Spanish class he was the best out of everyone. And so it was just because he was doing Duolingo quite a lot on the side, and because of that he was at least better than the rest of us. And so that made it sort of like a trend in the class to start studying Spanish in our free time. And that was actually my first reason to start not only studying Spanish but also like finding different ways to learn Spanish. And that is what actually got me to commit to that goal during the summer of 2022 and actually follow through. So yeah, that is actually really a good point. Having a curiosity, but also to have this, like, you have to have this burning desire to learn the language. A lot of people actually, when I was getting fluent, I was doing research on different apps, and I found an app called Language Transfer. So me and my friend started using that, and he wanted to gatekeep it about how good it was. And then because of that, we made it our goal, or we came together and said, like, you know what, during the summer of 2022, we're going to study an hour a day until we get fluent in Spanish. And that was the goal. But my friend actually gave up. He made it halfway through Language Transfer and he gave up. So during the summer, I was pretty much alone to study and get fluent in Spanish. And so this is actually true though. Having a genuine like motivation and a genuine reason to commit, having an actual commitment is really important. He actually had a reason to, because it was his like language that he sort of grew up speaking, and he had a reason to. I just did it for fun. It was a challenge me and my friends did. But either way, yes, this is one of the keys, one of the most important things or components.
To my 12-year-old eyes and ears, if you spoke Spanish at the time, you were the closest thing to a real-life superhero. Learning Spanish can be a long and challenging process, and many people give up because their desire to learn doesn't outweigh the struggles, because you will struggle. So the first thing to do is to really plant into your why. Why do you want to learn Spanish? The why can be simple, but it should be powerful enough to move and excite you. Maybe it's being starstruck by the beautiful display of colors, food, dance, and life during Mexico. Or maybe it's the Dominican girl next door who giggled at you when she saw you trying to dance bachata, and now you want to learn all about her culture and throw yourself into the language and food to impress her.
Yeah, this is one of the things that I also found really useful. That before the summer of 2022, when I was gonna get fluent, I told everyone that I was gonna get fluent in Spanish, and that committed me even more to it. And so yeah, this is actually important what he's saying, that you should have this reason to, you should really have a why to, and the more powerful that is, the more likely you are to achieve it. It's kind of like this thing, like if your mom was going to die if you didn't get fluent in a certain time period, you would probably get fluent in that time period, right? Because your why is very important, very big. So yeah, this is good advice for now.
It can be cheesy and simple like that, but it should be powerful enough to make you obsess over the idea of being able to speak Spanish. My why was pretty basic. I wanted to make friends with the kids around me, get the courage to finally talk to the girl down the street, and not feel left out when trying to make friends. So it was super simple, but this why was seated long enough that it carried a powerful emotional weight to motivate me. Stage 2, school. I got into middle school, and the first thing we did was pick our classes for the year. I picked up the list of available classes, and my eyes, like a hawk, spotted the needle in the haystack of courses. It read, Spanish for beginner. My heart instantly jumped with excitement at the idea of learning how to speak Spanish. And then classes started. And to my surprise, I was not a fluent Spanish speaker after the first week. We did likely what most grade school language classes do. Sing the alphabet song, learn to say, Hola, me llamo Jerry, encantado de conocerte. All of that is standard and helpful, but I felt like I was moving at snail speed. I felt like I would take 2 steps forward during the 30-minute class and then 1.9 steps back the rest of the day. So my Spanish dragged. But there is one thing that stood out from middle school that I would recommend. I stumbled on a site called studyspanish.com, and this became the holy grail of learning basics for me. The lessons made sense, they broke down the grammar rules, they gave quizzes to practice what you learned. So I pretty much tossed the books they gave us in school aside, and I focused on study Spanish to learn the basics of Spanish grammar.
Okay, this is very interesting and kind of similar to what I did. So first, if you don't know, in Sweden, in 6th grade, you choose between a third language to learn. So in Sweden, you learn Swedish, English, and then you pick between French or Spanish, or sometimes German, but in our school, it was just French and Spanish. And most of us picked Spanish. And for the first year, we did very similar things to this. We would essentially just make presentations of like introducing yourself. Hola, me llamo Hamid, blah, blah, blah. These are my hobbies. And after I discovered the app called Language Transfer, the app Language Transfer also did essentially what this guy is saying that it did for him. And it taught essentially the entirety of Spanish grammar. He mentioned a website called studyspanish.com. The thing is, a lot of these websites are written as opposed to like listening. And the great thing about Language Transfer was it's like a podcast, or you listen to it essentially. It is something that you just listen to like a podcast. But I saw that studyspanish.com is written. It's like a quiz website almost. And I can't say too much, but because it is written, it is still slightly worse. But even so, the first apps I used were Duolingo, Memrise, and like Anki. Didn't mean so like it was still going very well for him. But in my opinion, I would still a listening one, a podcast one, where you're actually listening to the words being said is better. Though it still seemed to help him. And for me, after I got the grammar down, then I went to actually getting fluent using the fluency equation. I want to see how he implements that at least.
By the time I left middle school, I wasn't able to say more than a few sentences at a time, but I did snag key number 2 to learning Spanish. I learned the basic Spanish grammar and language structures, just enough to be able to start making simple sentences. You can and do learn Spanish mostly by interacting and consuming content in Spanish.
Yes, that's true.
But it's hard for your brain to know where to put all that information sometimes if you don't have the basics of grammar down.
Okay, yeah, this is very true. When I first started learning Spanish, I first went over the entirety of grammar using Language Transfer. Before the summer, I went through the course once, and then during the summer, I went through it one more time. And that's because, as he says, to get the basics of grammar down, to get the grammar and the structure of Spanish in like in a comprehensible way is key, because then you can start making simple sentences. And that's the great thing about Language Transfer, which I also love, is that he gives you native sentences that people would actually say. That's also something that I do in my own course, which I give my clients.
You don't have to spend too long here. Just pick one grammar rule at a time and try to listen to it as you go about your day and consume Spanish content, and then stack that until you learn most of the grammar patterns.
And this is very true what he said about not only Spanish content, but that interacting with natives is how you're going to learn most of your Spanish. Most of your Spanish is going to be from natives, and that is because the goal is fluency, right? And fluency, by definition, is an equation which I call the fluency equation, which is speaking multiplied by understanding. And both of these are at a native level. So the way I got fluent was very similar to this, was that I would watch native Spanish content as my listening exercise, and I would try to understand that. And then I would try understanding that. and then I'll go back to listening that part again, and I'll just repeat that over and over again. And if for speaking, I'll just speak Spanish, and when I didn't know how to say something, I'll then go back, try to find either the grammar rule or the word that I was missing or whatever I was missing, and then I would repeat it again, say what I was trying to say. And that's literally, like, to put it down, that is how I got fluent, and that is how literally anyone's gonna ever get fluent in their language, because fluency by definition is that. It is your ability to speak and understand the language, because a conversation is that, right? I speak, you understand, you speak, I understand. There's only two abilities that is being tested in a conversation, that is speaking and understanding. Therefore, any exercise that gets you there is by definition going to help you get fluent in Spanish.
High school was much of the same, a continuation of the standard school language education. But two special things happened during high school. In my senior year, we had our first class that was conducted all in Spanish. We had to speak and listen to Spanish for 30 minutes plus a day. I was taking AP Spanish at the time, which is meant to be fully taught and run in the language. And boy, this was a struggle. I owe a lot to the folks that run the AP Spanish program, but my brain would hurt for 30 minutes every day. But this was the first time I experienced what being surrounded by Spanish actually felt like, where you couldn't just memorize 3 phrases and then go back to English. You had to keep drowning in the language whether you could swim or not. You were actually immersed. The second special thing that happened—
That is actually a really good point. Being immersed in the language. I actually wish that I did actually have that, where I could just be surrounded by Spanish. Immersing yourself is the best way to get fluent in Spanish. Literally, like, there's nothing else to it. The best way to get fluent in Spanish is to immerse yourself with that. Because the equation to fluency is speaking and understanding, and by definition, if you're surrounded by Spanish and you're in the waters, as he said, of Spanish, either way you're going to be forced to do these. This is how we learned our native language. Either way, you're immersed in your native language when you're a kid. So either way, you're exercising your speaking and understanding ability. This is why a lot of natives don't actually know how to write or read in their native language, but they can still speak and be fluent in their native language. For example, I have 2 friends who speak Arabic. They don't know how to write or read Arabic, but they can speak and understand it completely fine. And that is because of this exact same thing. And so when the goal is to get fluent, there's no such thing as reading or writing or anything like that, because that is absolute garbage, because that's not the goal, right? The goal is fluency, which means the goal is speaking and understanding. And that is why also this website, studyspanish.com, isn't as good, in my opinion, as language transfer or a course like mine, because it is written, it is reading and writing. It is not about listening.
Was that I started watching shows in Spanish. I brought my immersion home. I remember watching a show called Decisiones Extremas that was so overly dramatic that you could watch and understand the full episode even if you didn't understand a single word that they said. The Spanish wrecked me and I couldn't understand much, but the fact that I could get the episodes just by watching the show made it interesting enough for me to sit through episode after episode without getting bored. And
this is kind of one of those things that I see a lot of people do. The main exercise I use to get fluent in Spanish, I call transcript training, and it is pretty much this, where I watch native Spanish content. The difference is, he seems to just be watching it and not understanding it. My method was very similar to another method which I found on YouTube. It was this YouTuber named Language Lord, and this was before I started learning Spanish. And this guy watched native Spanish content, but he wouldn't just watch it, he would study it. He would study exactly what they said, and using that, he was able to understand sort of like the Spanish going on there. Essentially, he would watch the native Spanish content and study what's going on. Every single word that they say, he would study it. And that is very similar to what I did. The method of how we studied it slightly differs. But either way, at least getting yourself immersed in listening to Spanish is still good, but I would probably not do it in this way. The way I at least did it was that I would study native Spanish content as opposed to just watching it and listening to it. Because in that way, you're able to get down vocabulary much faster and much more effective than anything else, like Anki or anything like that.
It was awesome to be able to continue my immersion at home and listen to what real Spanish sounded like versus classroom Spanish.
This is a really good point. I call it Spanish versus real Spanish. Real Spanish is extremely fast spoken and extremely like that. Classroom Spanish, as he describes it, or just like the Spanish that we know, because growing up, like, everyone knows that Spanish as hola, me llamo Hamid, me gusta hablar español. Entonces, tú vas. You know what I mean? That's what we think Spanish is, when in reality, real Spanish is like, ahora estoy hablando español, estoy hablando muy rápido porque quiero mostrarte que el español es muy rápido y no es como te parece en el aula, en las aulas, so, or the classrooms, whatever classroom is. But
if I had to do this today, I'd probably recommend easier content than the struggle I put myself through with Decisiones. Now you have channels like the Easy Spanish YouTube channel that give you the real life Spanish, but also handhold you through it more. Those videos should be a lot easier to watch and pick up from and actually understand some of the Spanish.
I don't like this advice. This advice, in my opinion, is one of the things that hold a lot of people back. You get better at what you do. That is just the fact of life. If you do more squats, you're going to get better at squats. So it makes no sense to do push-ups to get better at squats, even though there might be a correlation, right? And so the same thing applies. If you would watch native Spanish content and get used to that, you're going to now understand that better. You're going to get better at that. And if you listen to slow Spanish, classroom Spanish, you're going to start getting good at that. But you never wanted to get good at classroom Spanish, did you? Well, you wanted to get good at native Spanish. So why would you do anything but that? And a lot of people like to say, okay, I'm not going to be able to understand. And that's kind of what he's saying. He's saying he's not going to be able to understand. In that case, what I like to do is, because some of the times I also had this very similar situation. I was watching a Spanish show and this girl said something crazy, which was, or I'll give you an example. This girl was like, acá estoy, okay? And I was like, what are you talking about? Acá estoy. And what she actually said was acá estoy, but they say it very quickly, so it's acá estoy. And simply what I'll do is open the subtitles, see the sentence, and then I'll use 2 apps to really understand this, or 2 or 3 apps, okay? And those apps are essentially just grammar and translating apps, okay? For grammar, I would use either Language Transfer or Spanish Dict. Language Transfer was sort of a teacher explaining it, and SpanishDict.com was just like no explanation, just here's the cheat sheet essentially. And then DeepL was the translating website I used. But the great thing about this, even if I wasn't able to hear it, the subtitles even wrote it down. And this is especially good about Netflix because the subtitles are handwritten, or on TED Talks. A lot of people use TED Talks. The TED Talks have handwritten transcript, which means that the words are actually the words that are being said, even if they don't catch it. Sometimes they don't catch all the words, in which case I slow it down and then speed it back up. That is the method I use. When I don't pick up the word, I go back, slow it down, and then try to pick up the words along with the subtitles and context. And that's how I would sort of pick it up. At that point, a lot of people can pick it up, okay? My point being, you get better at what you do. And so if you get used to this easy version of Spanish, congratulations, now you know easy version of Spanish. If you get used to hard, fast, native spoken Spanish, you're going to get better at that. And that is why when I study Spanish, I would only focus on native Spanish and I would only speak to natives. And that is why, even when I speak Spanish now, I will automatically feel more comfortable speaking fast because that's what I've gotten used to. When I edit these videos, I speed them up. When I'm doing every cut, I speed up the video so that I can get through the content like faster because it's a lot. And what happens is, when I speed it up, I get used to hearing my voice at a very sped up speed. And when I go back and listen to the regular version sounds like a slow version because I've gotten used to the sped up version of me speaking. The same thing applies where when I go back and make it slow and listen to myself speaking slowly in slow speed, then when I put it back to regular speed sounds faster than normal because your normal is what you get used to. And so if you get used to fast Spanish, your normal is fast Spanish. But if you get used to slow Spanish, now fast Spanish is going to sound even faster than it actually is. Point being, you get used to what you do. And if you do slow Spanish, if you get used to slow Spanish, then fast Spanish is going to seem even faster. Whereas if you do the inverse, if you get used to fast Spanish, then slow Spanish is just going to sound even slower. And so this advice of watching slow Spanish content, it is just garbage. All of these YouTubers, the most popular Spanish YouTubers, honestly, like they have hundreds of thousands or even millions of subscribers, are the ones that are giving you the worst advice ever. And that's also why school Spanish or classroom Spanish is also bad. Damn, I'm not going to cut out that voice crack.
And then came university. Senior year of high school and university were very similar. I would do my hour of Spanish class and then try to watch a show later in the day to refresh my Spanish. During this school period, I was doing a lot of listening and some writing, so my listening skills went through the roof and my writing got okay. But I still never spoke Spanish for more than 5 to 10 phrases at a time in class.
Yeah. And that's sort of understandable because he got good at writing Spanish, but notice how speaking it didn't get improved because fluency by definition is speaking and understanding. And if you don't speak or understand or listen to Spanish rather, you won't get better at that. He did get better at listening to Spanish though.
At the time, I didn't know about language exchange partners that you can find from places like Tandem, but this would have been perfect to practice with someone that I don't know, over the phone so I'm not embarrassed, and in a language learning context so they're expecting me not to have the language down. But this was another mistake I made at the time. College was when I found the second grammar tool I became a big fan of. It was called the Manual de Gramática by Zulma Eguina. The explanations were super clear and simple, and this is probably one of my favorite tools to this day. For grammar, out of all the stuff that's out there, there, I really think you can just keep it simple and use studyspanish.com, Manual de Gramática, and one more tool that I'll share with you later in the video. Besides this grammar book, another thing I started doing in university was listening to music in Spanish. I saved all the really slow songs like Agua by Jarabe de Palo and El Rey by Jose Alfredo Jimenez. And I made a playlist that I would listen to in my free time. That's how I snagged key number 3. Consume lots of content in Spanish around your interests. If you like cooking,
yeah, that is very important. To consume content in Spanish, especially around your interest, is very good because you'll learn vocabulary that you use. I talk a lot about learning Spanish, and so if I watch Spanish content about learning Spanish, I get that vocabulary down. Or let's say I talk a lot about religion, then I would probably watch religion channels in Spanish. Do you know what I mean? Because then you pick up vocabulary that you can actually use. But again, not just consume it, but to actually study it. So to actually study what is going on, listening to it in your free time is a good way to sort of get that immersion and that feeling of Spanish. But actually studying it is definitely more effective than doing anything else. And he also mentioned that for grammar, he used a book and a website. Both of those aren't heard at all. None of them are based on audio, but they're based on written text. Studying Spanish grammar as written text is an extremely slow process, and it's not practicing anything in the fluency equation. It's not practicing your speaking or your understanding. In terms understanding, by the way, is talking about listening, about audio, about audible things. So I would not recommend those tools. I have different videos about grammar. I recommend just anything that explains it well. Though his book, which he mentioned, said they explain grammar very well, and explaining the grammar about why certain things happen in grammar is very important. So in my opinion, I'll just read language transfer because it's audible. It's an actual like audible thing that you listen to. But also language transfer explains the why behind the grammar as well, which is why it works really well.
Watch cooking shows in Spanish from Equatorial Guinea. Go see Encanto in Spanish if you like Disney films. Whatever it is, make it easy to have Spanish fit into your life around your interests. Playlists, shows, the people you follow, all of it. Stage 3, study abroad. The 4th key I picked up right before I left university.
To study abroad is actually one of the best ways. Like to be in a Spanish-speaking country is also another one of the best ways because you're constantly practicing the fluency equation, right? You're constantly speaking and listening to Spanish, and that is the equation to be fluent. So this is very interesting. But also, I also did this where for 1 week, our class, we had like a trip to Spain, and it is the exact same place that he's talking about. And that place that he showed, I actually went to that exact same spot, which is really interesting. Anyways, that was just something I want to point out.
One of my last semesters of college, we had 5 months to be in the country, so I set out on a quest. I took a personal language pledge and said I wasn't going to speak, write, listen, read, or even think in English as long as I was in Sevilla. This was really hard at first. My brain had no way to escape Spanish, and I loved it. I struggled at first. I sort of stopped talking to most people because I didn't have enough Spanish for back and forth conversations. And I felt like my brain was empty almost all the time because I wouldn't let myself think in English, and I didn't yet have the fluency to have a lot of coherent thoughts in Spanish. Soon I started talking to myself in Spanish, both in my mind and sometimes literally talking to myself before I had enough confidence to speak to other people. Bit by bit, I started to understand more and more Spanish. Then I started to write, and then I started to speak. Safe to say, Google Translate and Spanish Dict became the 2 most used apps on my phone at the time.
Exactly, and this really does prove what I was trying to say. He used a translator app and SpanishDict.com, which is what I also used. And this is because these 2 tools is essentially the cheat sheet for vocabulary or speaking and grammar. And within the fluency equation, Spanish is literally just that. It is grammar times vocabulary. A sentence is words and then the placement of those words and the conjugation of the verbs. That is what an entire sentence is in Spanish. And so those 2 tools, for me, I use DeepL as a translator, which is just a better translator, and SpanishDict.com for verb conjugation. And this is very accurate to what happened to me as well. I was in Spain. I was conversationally fluent, so I didn't, it seems like he had to use it every single time for like every single sentence they said. When I was in Spain, I was living actually with a Spanish household. I was in the household with the family because it was a language exchange. And so I was speaking Spanish with their parents and just their family. We'd have conversations about just anything, even at the dinner table. And yeah, He got 5 months there, and this is really good. This is where he really does apply the fluency equation very well, where he's immersed in Spanish. He's constantly speaking and listening to Spanish, which are exactly the 2 ladders that you need to climb to get fluent in Spanish, which are like, I call them learn, sir. I don't want to go into too conceptual details, but the fluency equation is essentially 2 ladders called learn, sir. Listen, understand, repeat is learn, and speak, understand, and repeat is sir. And that is how you get better at speaking and understanding. It is not complicated. If you want to get better at understanding native Spanish, you have to listen and understand native Spanish. You want to get better at speaking Spanish, you want to speak and understand Spanish. It is that simple. And so I bet he made the most progress in this period because he was applying these methods the most in that time. Though I'm kind of surprised. It seemed like he's been studying Spanish for like 4 years at this point or something crazy, because he made it past middle school and he studied Spanish in his free time. And then he made it to college, and all in that time he was studying Spanish. So it seemed kind of surprising that he still, I don't know, whatever.
While abroad, some other things I did to improve my Spanish were I switched all my consumption to Spanish, changed all my devices to Spanish, phone, laptop, Google accounts, you name it. I built playlists of songs all in Spanish, and I started to watch every show in Spanish on Netflix, like Élite, La Casa de Papel, La Catedral del Mar, Velvet, everything that was out there. I then started journaling before bed in Spanish, and the writing was a good habit to get into. As for vocab and grammar, I switched to watching Spanish with Vicente on YouTube for advanced Spanish concepts, and Lethal Crisis also on YouTube for fast, natural Spanish outside the teaching context.
Yes, and that is really good to use. This one is probably going to be better again because you get better at what you study. So if you study slow Spanish, then good luck. You're now better at slow Spanish. But I assume the other channel is also a good channel when it comes to conceptual grammar things. If you do want to see more conceptual grammar videos, then just comment it so I know that maybe that will be better. I'm probably going to start doing more conceptual Spanish things because a lot of the explanations out there are absolute garbage. So yeah.
More from things like short films. Lastly, I discovered what I would say is the 3rd grammar resource I'd actually recommend. EspanolAvanzado.com was the first site I discovered that had niche language concepts explained beautifully in a way that English speakers could really relate to and understand. By the time I left Spain, I was confident enough to listen, read, write, and speak in Spanish. I still made tons of mistakes all the time, but I grew comfortable that I could understand Spanish, have conversations, and live all in Spanish, even with those mistakes. Study abroad was a big leap forward for my Spanish.
Yeah.
So key number 4 of the 5 essential keys for me was Spanish immersion. In my case, I spent 5 months in Spain, but I don't think immersion means you have to go to another country. It means a dedicated period of time where you try to live and think in Spanish as much as possible.
Yes, that is really, really good what you just said. When I got fluent in the summer of 2022, during the time that I was studying, I was studying native Spanish content that is fast spoken, like actually spoken like a native Spanish speaker would speak. Then in my free time, I'll try thinking in Spanish as much as I could, like he was doing. And also in my free time, I'll do an exercise I call narrate, elaborate, contemplate, which is just my speaking exercise that I did. And I'll do that outside of my listening exercise because the speaking exercise is great because you can do it 24/7. I have a video, I think the video is called The One Daily Habit That Got Me Fluent in Spanish. That video, I go through exactly how to do this exercise, and I would do that exercise as much as I could in my free time. And so yes, I also did what I did was like, I changed my phone language to Spanish. That helped like a very little amount, I'm going to be honest. But yes, immersion is the best way to get fluent in Spanish. There's nothing better than that. And the only reason for that is because immersion is where you're forced to speak and listen to Spanish. And the fluency equation is that. Speaking and listening to Spanish and understanding it. That is the fluency equation. Speaking multiplied by understanding. And so the best way to achieve that is immersion. And that is how we got fluent as kids as well. In reality, this is not a different method. This is the method everyone has been using to get fluent in their native language for literally since the beginning of time. Right? And so that method works. And when I implemented that method, it worked faster than anything else.
Try to eliminate English or your language completely from your life for a time. I've done this back in the US through a mix of changing the content I listen to, read, and watch, finding language partners to call and have conversations with, and using virtual reality language experiences. I really believe after learning the basics of Spanish, going through a period of intensive Spanish where you try to live and think as much in Spanish as humanly possible really accelerates your Spanish Spanish learning. Stage 4, solo studying back in the US. The last key, number 5, is what I'm living through now.
Back then I used to drive off Mason. Those cops now you
I've returned from Spain. I make efforts to keep Spanish in my life daily, and I try to advance by learning Spanish from different regions. Sometimes I learn vocab, slang, and patterns unique to Mexican Spanish. Other times I'll do Argentinian Spanish, and I have a lot more to go. The resources I use most today are Español Avanzado to learn complex and hard to find grammar rules. I continue to watch shows and listen to music almost exclusively in Spanish. I find language exchange partners, mostly through Tandem, to meet other language students that I can practice texting and calling in Spanish with. And lastly, I think the language exams, they're called the daily exams for Spanish, are actually really useful at this stage to help you organize your studying, give you something to strive to, and improve your Spanish at that level. Otherwise, it might feel like you're not fully done with Spanish, but you're not sure what to learn or how to advance. So for the Spanish C2 exam, I did a bunch of writing, a ton of 500-word short essays on space exploration, economic development in Latin America, deforestation, and other topics that you probably don't get to practice in your everyday life talking to other people. In all, I'd summarize the last key, number 5, as polish, go deep on your specific interests in Spanish, and consider taking a C-level Spanish daily exam. And don't forget to use your Spanish to form relationships with other people, because that's likely why you started learning in the first place.
This is sort of what he's saying is sort of, it's good, but at the same time there's still some nuances to it. I agree that, like, as natives we got really good at our own native language by doing, like, writing essays, for example, in school about deforestation, right? And so doing that in Spanish could get you to that, like, ability to live in, like, fully live in that country. Because, like, writing and reading, it is not necessary to be fluent in Spanish, but it is necessary to be, like, a full-blown, you're living in the country, you need to write. Because even in English, for us English speakers, you still need to be able to read and write complex essays and stuff in English, no matter if you're writing, like, a formal letter, or if you're in school and you have to write, like, an assignment or, like, an essay. And so doing that in Spanish could help if that was your goal. But most of us, our goal is just to be able to be fluent. And when it comes to native level fluency in terms of speaking, it is literally just to continue improving in those endeavors in terms of speaking and understanding. It is just to continue the fluency equation. Essentially watching Spanish content but in different accents around the world. That is a really good way to also improve your Spanish. And that is what I'm doing right now, sort of trying to get myself to native fluency. Native fluency is essentially just you have a good accent and you're able to understand the really fast spoken Spanish. Reading Spanish is like, you don't actually need it to be considered like natively fluent, in my opinion. Because I know native Arabic speakers that they speak Arabic perfectly fine, perfect accent, everything, but they can't read or write in the language. But they still use it every single day, right? But when it comes to, like, if writing is actually important for you and your goals, yeah, of course you should get better at that. Now, all in all, I thought he was going to talk about how getting fluent in 30 days is not realistic or anything like that, but maybe he'll mention it at the end.
Tu experiencia de viaje más memorable en Argentina hasta el momento.
Pero mucho de juntarnos con amigos y nada, esos son recuerdos muy lindos.
That's my Spanish learning experience, and it's just one way to do it.
So something he said at the end there was about how this is just one way to do it. And in reality, there is actually just one way to do it, and that is the fluency equation. Anyone who ever got fluent did that. This is very interesting because this video right here, I learned to speak Spanish in 30 days, and then I learned to speak Spanish in 96 hours straight. Again, voice cracks, stick out everyone. This YouTuber, Shauma NYC, was the YouTuber that also did exactly what I was talking about, where he got fluent Spanish very quickly using this exact method I was talking about. All in all, I think he spent a lot of time for something that he could have gotten faster. Either way, right? If you're using the regular method to learn Spanish, you're pretty much going to get fluent after many years. But you can see his journey was sort of very slow in the beginning, in the first, like, this part of the journey, very slow. Then he implemented the fluency equation and actually hyperfixated on it, which is what I did in the summer of 2022 as well. And that is where he saw the most progress, until afterwards he's in that stage, which I'm also kind of in, where he's just trying to polish up his Spanish and speak more. So definitely, this is a realistic sort of Spanish journey, and it's sort of similar to mine. Either way, like, he made the most progress in Spanish by actually doing the thing that I also did in Spanish in the summer of 2022. And so what I'm really trying to say is that the method to getting fluent is the same. It is just all about immersion. It is just all about the fluency equation. Speaking multiplied by understanding. If you want to learn more about that, you can check out my other videos where I go in depth exactly how to do this intensive period of Spanish immersion, the method to that at least. And if you want one-on-one coaching with me where I can teach you these methods and get similar results as me, then check the description. And I hope this video helped you, bro, and stay on.